Hello family and welcome back. Today's tutorial is about how to cut and sew this elegant corporate pencil dress. Along the way you learn valuable sewing techniques like drafting of a princess dart, Bustier and front wraps. Be sure to subscribe and like for more sewing tutorials. For this dress we'll be using a heavyweight stretchy fabric which is 2 yards for skirt and top parts. With me is also front drafting pattern paper with shoulder line, bust line, under bust line and waistline drawn on it. Alright, let's start with basic round neckline drafting. I'll go with 3 inches neck depth by 3 inches neck width, after which I'll use a curved ruler to draw smooth neckline just like that. Let's move on to marking half shoulder measurement or shoulder line, which in my case is 6.5 plus 0.5 inches stitching allowance. And on top of that, I'll go down by 1 inch for shoulder slope. So now we'll draw shoulder slope from neck width to the mark. With that completed, let's mark chest line from shoulder slope. Use the formula on screen to find your chest line and mark as well from where you'll be required to draw a line across, then label as chest line. It's time to carry forward half shoulder measurement measured on shoulder line earlier to the drawn chest line, just so you can use it to draw a straight armhole depth in that manner. Also, mark quarter-bar circumference on chest line from center front still. After doing that, find armhole depth midpoint just like I'm doing in mark. On top of it, go in with 0.5 inches from that exact mark so that you can use the 3 points in coming up with a smooth armhole curve using a French curve ruler. Guys, let's now mark half bust span on waistline, then again on bust line from center front. When done, you'll be required to draw that line from waistline to bust line. This is just a base to get you started when drafting a shoulder princess dart bustier. Now measure 0.5 inches towards center front, then 3/4 inches on the opposite side, just so you can draw 2 parallel lines from waistline mark to under bust line as can be seen. And further on, go down by 1 inch from bust line on that line still. Once done, use a French curve ruler to draw some 2 tiny curves on sides as you are about to see. Okay, let's find shoulder slope midpointed mark. From the mark, measure about 0.5 inches, after which go ahead and make an extension of that line from bust line right to the mark on the shoulder slope line. In addition to that, measure 0.5 inches on each side of that line extension, which will join to bust line with lines. And let's go. After drawing on one side in ink, I'll use a pencil on the left side since it's not the final drawing. After it, mark deep neckline from shoulder line at the center line, and on top of that, use a curved ruler to come up with sweetheart neckline in that manner. And if you don't have one, just draw freehand. Having drawn sweetheart neckline, measure 0.25 inches outwards to prevent gaping. And when done, you can go ahead and make the lines visible after achieving the look we want. Now we'll be focusing on extending shoulder slope line like that so that we are able to replace that allowance on it, then on armhole curve through to avoid any shortages, and lastly on chest line. This leads us to new armhole curve drawing, and just like in the previous case, use a French curve ruler for extra support. One more thing is to finish up shoulder slope as well. Time to move on to having quarter waist circumference marked on waistline from center front, plus about 1¼ inches dart replacement, plus 1¼ inches more stitching allowance. Since we earlier marked quarter bust circumference on chest line, you are only required to add 1¼ inches stitching allowance so that you can finish up front bodice outline in that manner. Here I'm just cutting a long outline only because I need to use this to come up with back pattern before cutting through the princess dart. Don't worry, this step is quite simple. First thing, draw a line about 1¼ inches away from the side edge from top to bottom, which represents zip allowance. With that in mind, mark out chest line, waistline and shoulder line on the back pattern paper both sides. And given that, square out shoulder line, chest line and waistline on it again. It's equally important to label each of the drawn lines just as I'm doing. From there, mark 1 inch neck depth from center line, then 3 inches basic neck width on shoulder line to be used for neckline drawing. And still from the center line, guys, take half shoulder measurement on shoulder line, go down by 1 inch for shoulder slope, then align like that from the mark to the neckline width. Next step is carrying forward half shoulder measurement to chest line, which only helps in achieving straight vertical armhole depth. That being so, measure quarter bust circumference or bust measurement divided by 4 on chest line. When done, draw a tiny armhole curve right at the junction in that manner. With that completed, measure half bust span on waistline for that intake and again on chest line, then draw that line as can be seen. In addition to that, measure that legs of 0.5 inches each, then reduce that depth by 1 inch from chest line. And further on, draw lines radiating towards that leg. From there, mark quarter waist circumference on waistline plus 1 inch that replacement plus 1¼ inches more stitching allowance. And on top of that, add some stitching allowance measurements to chest line in order to draw back bodice side outline. Here I'm cutting out along side outline, then later we'll cut along armhole and neckline. We just finished back top part drafting. Now let's cut through front princess that bustier, neckline and shoulder line. Let's move on to skirts front part drafting. Take note that this pattern paper is on fold and right at the top is waistline. With that in mind, I'll take waistline to full length line measurement at 43 inches plus 2 inches folding allowance. Next up, I'll also take waistline to hip line measurement at 10 inches so that I can square out hip line and full length lines across marks put. Okay, let's put in body measurement starting with waistline. After marking quarter waist circumference, add 1¼ inches stitching allowance. From there, also mark quarter hip circumference on hip line plus 1¼ inches stitching allowance. And lastly, on the full length line, measure about 7 inches only if you're a slim person working with a stretchy fabric plus stitching allowance. After marking out, it's time to draw front skirt outline in that manner. Here I'm cutting out along skirts outline. Now we'll be focusing on the skirts back part drafting. Bear in mind that this pattern paper is also on fold. First step being drawing zipper allowance about 1¼ inches from side edge top to bottom like that. Secondly, trace out all the drawn horizontal lines on the back pattern paper. When done, square out lines across marks put. And it's important to label each of the lines before proceeding to the next step. Given these points, take quarter waist circumference on waistline, which is basically waist measurement divided by 4 plus 1 inch that intake plus 1¼ inches more for stitching allowance. Same goes for hip line, whereby I'll mark quarter hip circumference plus 1¼ inches stitching allowance. And lastly, I'm going to also measure 7 inches as round bottom measurement plus stitching allowance. With measurements taken, go ahead and finish up skirts outline like I'm doing. On top of that, let's create that intake, which is why I'll mark half bust span on waistline, then draw that line in that manner. For that depth, I'll use 5 inches measured from waistline, that width being 1 inch, meaning 0.5 inches on each side of that line, after which I'll draw lines radiating towards the apex of the dart leg. Now let's focus on waist snatching, which its main aim is to prevent zip bulge. Measure 0.5 inches from original center line, then on the seam allowance as well, from where you'll be required to draw lines as you're about to see. Alright, let's cut out a long outline since we are done drafting. It's time to draw front wraps you saw on the dress. First step being measuring 10 inches hip line on the side that was folded. Then we'll go ahead and draw a line across it. For the bigger front wrap, find midpoint in between on the right side. On top of that, measure 1½ inches downwards from hip line and mark as well. Again on the side edge, measure 4 inches from waistline, which is to be joined to the first mark with the line. Also mark 4 inches on the right side edge from waistline too. And having finished, draw lines like I'm showing you. We are about to draw the second smaller front wrap. First step being finding midpoint there, and after marking, you're required to go down by 1 inch. Once done, also find waistline midpoint and mark. Given these points, draw lines for the second wrap as can be seen. In this next step, we are going to transfer each wrap one by one to a different sheet, so pay close attention as I start with pinning it down. After pinning, let's now trace out larger wrap on the sheet underneath with the help of a tracing wheel. I'm here and pinning just so I'm able to make lines visible from traces. Having traced, guys, go ahead and cut out a long outline. We just finished cutting out larger wrap. Now let's work on the smaller one. First thing first, secure them with pins, after which you'll also be required to trace out using a tracing wheel. For those who don't have one, you can also draw using a blunt edge. That also works perfectly well. After unpinning, we'll make lines visible following traces like that. Having traced, I'll cut out a long drawn line. With all patterns cut, with me are pieces of fabric from skirts pattern with enough allowance left on them. With me are also front wrap pieces traced from the drafted pattern. There are 2 of each. Also, here are top fabrics traced from the pattern papers with enough stitching allowance left on them. Take note that the front's middle panel is on fold. I have also traced outlining pieces for each panel. It's equally important to note that there are 2 ways of stitching front pieces, either by attaching middle panel with lining separately then side pieces follow, or better still, use this simple technique I'm showing you. This is me joining the first panel to middle piece from their bottom edges using straight normal stitches. Also me joining the second side piece to middle panel same way. Once done, notch just like that. This will allow the fabric to lay flat. This other technique is quite simple because after stitching back all panels separately, that is the main fabric and lining, you then stitch all round neckline put together with about 0.5 inches. After stitching, go ahead and notch all round the neckline again, and after that, top stitch the lining part very close to the joint. Here is how to go about back pieces. First, ensure the neck width is as wide as the front. I ought to have done this earlier but I forgot. So after marking, I'll cut it out. Then we'll also attach back linings to main fabrics from neckline. Pay close attention how that is achieved. For a neat basic dart, stitch from dart leg towards apex point like that. After stitching and ironing back pieces, this is how they look like. Here is also the front piece after ironing as well. Let's now waist snatch back top part. Measure 0.5 inches inwards, then the same measurement upwards just as I've done. After that, draw 2 lines as you're about to see from where you'll be required to cut. The line drawn is original center line. For new center line, measure 0.5 inches inwards again, then align in that manner. Let's now head over to the sewing machine and stitch loosely along new center line top to bottom. I'm done stitching from back center line. In this next step, we'll show you how to join shoulders by using one of the linings to cover up everything else, then stitch with 0.5 inches. Look how professional this came out. Now let's work on wrap pieces. We'll head over to the sewing machine again and stitch along bottom edges with 0.5 inches on both. If you encounter any difficulties when stitching on sides and waistline, feel free to leave a comment and I'll do my best to help. Now we'll be focusing on attaching back tops to skirt pieces. Put right sides together, make sure the darts align and stitch with 0.5 inches. Have attached front pieces from waistline. Do the same on back pieces as well. Alright, let's stitch loosely along center line from neckline to the mark, that is the zipper space. After back stitching, use normal stitches here and back stitch as well. Then loose stitches again around the slit area allowance. Stitch as explained. We'll now measure from shoulder line about 5 inches sleeve allowance and notch since it's not as full sleeve. After notching on both sides, you then need to stitch portion left around armhole from inside with 0.5 inches, front and back pieces separately. So it's now on the upper portion where you'll stitch your sleeve. Kindly comment down below if you're interested in knowing how to make this kind of sleeve. So now we'll head over to the sewing machine and fix this on the upper area like I'm about to do on the side after pinning it all round. Here's my lovely dress with sleeves fixed. I did also stitch a long hidden zipper on the space. Kindly don't forget to like this video and subscribe if it's your first time interacting with this channel for more interesting sewing tutorials.